Simon says subscribe and click on the bell icon to receive notifications.
All right, everyone, a really nice little session today just to run through some of the most sort of common errors that you'll get when you're working in Excel, and more importantly, what they mean and how you can fix them, because errors are something that we're all going to come across when we're working in our spreadsheets. And a lot of the time, they're not very explanatory. They're quite hard to understand what's going on. So hopefully we're going to sort of dispel some of these things for you. My name's Deborah Ashby. I'm a Microsoft MVP and instructor, and I absolutely love Excel. I've been training and supporting it for over 25 years. As I said, we all come across errors in Excel. There are so many different types of errors. So we're going to go through all of the main ones. The value error we're going to start out with. We're going to take a look at the hash, or what I call the behind the fence error. We're going to take a look at spill and calc errors, and you'll find these if you use a lot of dynamic array formulas. So for people using the later versions of Excel, where you have things like the filter function, the sort function, things like that, you may have encountered spill and calc errors. We have the infamous name error, the ref error, div, NA. We have all of these types of errors. We're going to look at them all. We're going to look at some examples, and then we're going to go through and take a look at how we can fix them. And then towards the end, we're just going to take a look at some of the tools that you have available to audit your formulas. It makes sort of troubleshooting and finding errors in your spreadsheets a little bit easier. And I'm also going to show you a couple of things that you can employ to make your spreadsheets as error-free as possible. So things like data validation and how you can protect certain cells in certain workbooks to prevent people from editing them. This is the first error that we're going to take a look at. So the value error. You may have come across this in your spreadsheets previously. Now, what this error basically means is that one of the arguments in your formula or your function is the wrong type. And I have two examples here to illustrate this a little bit better. Now, if you take a look at this first little table, you can see that I have a date in cell B7, and then we have just a piece of text in cell B8, and I've just put red in there. And we're getting a value error. Now, if I click on this cell, if you take a look in the formula bar, you can see that we have the workday formula in here. And you may or may not be familiar with this formula. If I click so you can see the arguments, what this formula basically does is it takes a start date. We then specify a number of days, and it will give us the ending date. So I quite often use this if I'm trying to fill out a spreadsheet where I have different project times. So I might put in the start date of the project. The project might take 5 days, and then Excel will produce the end date for me using the workday function. Now, this function requires the start date, which we have here in cell B7, so that's fine. But then the second argument is the number of days. So the formula is looking for a numeric value. It's looking for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. But instead, I've got a piece of text in this cell. That's why we're getting the value error. So really straightforward. All we would need to do is change this to a valid argument. So I'm going to put 5 days in there, hit enter, and you can see then the formula resolves itself and that value error disappears, and we're getting the result of a date. Always check the formula that you're using, because you're going to find you've probably got an invalid argument somewhere in the mix. The same here. So again, I just have some text in the cell and we're getting a value error. And that's because what I'm trying to do here is I'm using the month function in this cell. The month function will look at a date and it will extract the month number. Now, because I don't have a date in this cell, I have text. We're getting a value error. So in order for this to work correctly, I would just need to replace the text with a valid date. So if I just do 1/29/2024 again, you can see that that resolves itself, and it's telling me that the month number is 1, or January in this case. Okay, so two examples. Always check your arguments if you're getting a value error. Now, the second example that we have here, I need to calculate profit, and this is going to be a very basic calculation. We're just going to do revenue minus the costs. So let's do that. We're going to say equals. We're going to do the revenue, and we're just going to minus the cost. Really straightforward formula. If you want to stay in the same cell, instead of hitting enter, press Control Enter. That will keep you in the same cell. Because if you want to double click to copy this down, then that's a lot easier than having to move back up to the cell you were in. Let's drag the formula down, and notice I'm not getting any errors here. This all looks fine. Even though we have empty cells in here, Excel is still performing the calculation correctly. It's just treating these as zeros. Now, what if I had put some text in here? So maybe we haven't received the costs yet. So I've got pending in here and I have pending in here. It's going to switch those to value errors. And again, it's because it doesn't recognize that we've got text in a cell. It can't perform the calculation. So how would we fix this? Well, we could just simply remove the words pending, or if you wanted to keep those in there, because sometimes you might want to keep text within a cell, I might want those to say pending. If I want these calculations to still work and not have value errors in here, what I could do in this particular instance is go up to the formula bar where we have the calculation and just wrap this in a sum. So we're going to do sum, open the bracket, close the bracket, hit enter, and then when we pull this down, we should find that those calculations will work again, but we've got text in here. So that's a way that you can get around that if you do want to have text in those cells. So value errors, always check the arguments because there's going to be something wrong there. Now, this is one that's fairly common. I'm pretty sure that most of you are going to know what this is and know how to fix it. And that is what we call behind the fence, because it does look like a fence when we get this row of hash symbols. And you'll get this quite often, particularly when you're dealing with very large data sets. You'll see, or you'll open up the file, you'll have these hash marks in some of the columns. Now, notice it's not all of the columns. It's only columns that contain numeric values. Where we have columns that contain text, we don't get those hash symbols. Now, all this means, and I'm sure you know already, is that the column isn't wide enough to accommodate the values that we have in those cells. That's why we're getting the hashes. So the easiest way to fix this is just simply to widen out the columns. Now, if you have a large data set, don't go through each one just dragging to widen them out. You can do them all in one go, simply by selecting all of the columns. And then you can hover your mouse over any of the column boundaries or dividers at the top here. I'm going to hover mine between columns P and Q and just simply double click and it will widen out all of those columns for you. And you can see as soon as we do that and we give ourselves a bit more room, those hashes disappear. So that's a really, really simple one to fix. These are newer errors in Excel, and you'll come across these if you have one of the later versions of Excel. So Excel 365 or maybe Excel 2021, because these apply to dynamic array formulas. And when I say dynamic array formulas, I mean things like the filter function, the sort function, XLOOKUP, any formula that spills its results down cells. Now, if you're still a little bit confused as to what I mean, we're going to run through a quick example. Now, let's start with the spill error first of all. What we're looking at here in this example is I basically have a little list here. It's a very short data set of some students. You might recognize some of these names in there. And these students have sat two different exams. So let's say maths and history. And then we have the grade that they achieved in the third column of this table. Now, what I want to do is over here, I want to be able to select a subject from the drop down, so either maths or history, and select a grade and have it return over here all of the students from the table that match my selections. Now, these over here are just simply data validation drop-down lists that I've set up for both the subject and the grade. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the filter function to filter out all of the results that I'm looking for. In this case, students that sat the subject maths and achieved the grade A. Now, if you've never used the filter function before, this will be a good little reminder. You can type in filter. The first thing we need to specify is the array. So what do we want to return? Which columns from the table do we want to return? Now I want to return the student, the subject, and the grade. So effectively I want to return everything from the table. So my array is going to be the entire table. Now I've just called my table table 1. I haven't renamed it, hence why it's showing table 1 in the formula, comma. What do I want to include? Well, I only want to see in my results students that sat the maths exam and got a grade of A. So that's 2 pieces of criteria. Now, when you're using the filter function, if you have more than one piece of criteria, you need to wrap them in brackets. So I'm going to open a bracket and we're going to say include when the subject is equal to what we have in cell C7. Close the bracket. And we represent and with an asterisk, then we can type in our second piece of criteria. And when the grade is equal to what we have in cell C9. Close the bracket and close filter. So that is our filter formula. If you've never seen this before, that might be something new for you. If we hit enter, you can see it returns from the table all of the students that with the subject maths and the grade of A. Now, everything's fine so far. We haven't encountered any type of error. Now, what if I was to change this to, let's go for history and B. Check out what I'm getting. I'm getting a spill error. Now, why am I getting a spill error? Well, you'll see this when you don't have enough room for all of the results to be spilled down. There's normally something under your data set or where you want your result to be returned that's getting in the way. So I have my student table underneath. So there's not enough room for the results to spill down. That's why I'm getting this error. So this is easily fixed by simply moving this out of the way. So I'm just going to grab it and I'm going to put it over here. As soon as I do that, the error resolves itself and the results spill down. So if you see a spill error, don't get scared. That's all it is. Just move whatever's underneath out of the way. If I change it to history and A, I'm now getting a calc error. So this is the other error that you might see when you're working with dynamic array functions. Now, what is a calc error? Well, it means that there are no results. So it's not finding any students that sat history and achieved a grade A in my results table, hence why we're getting a calc error. Now, if I was to send this spreadsheet to somebody else, they might look at this and think, oh God, there's something wrong with the spreadsheet. Have I made an error? Have I touched something and it's broken? So you're probably going to want to make this a little bit more explanatory so people don't think that something's gone wrong, because this isn't technically an error. It just means that there's no results in the table. Now, there's a couple of ways that we could deal with this. We could add some error handling onto the front here by wrapping it in an if error. And we're going to look at that a bit later on. But if you're using something like filter, if we click at the end here, notice the third optional argument of if empty. That allows us to define what we want it to display in the cell if it can't find any results. So if we press comma, I want it to say no records. Hit enter, and now instead of calc error, we're just going to get no records. Okay, so that's a much better way of dealing with that rather than just leaving it as #calc, for example. All right, so those are two of the newer errors that you might come across. Worth looking out for those when you're using dynamic array functions. Now, name error, one of the really common errors. This generally occurs when a name isn't recognized. So that might be a function name, or it might be something like a range name. Now, a name error will normally occur if you've misspelt a function name. And I know this happens to me often. When I'm typing really quickly, I might type, instead of sum, I might type som or something like that. And before I know it, I've pressed tab and I've got a name error because the name of the formula is actually wrong. And that's the case in this first example. Here, I'm trying to work out what the average revenue is for each of these sales agents. If you take a look at it, you can see that the formula is just AVG. So maybe I'm not very good at Excel, or maybe I'm a new user. And based on the fact that to total or add up numbers, you use sum, maybe I think that to find an average, you use AVG. I've typed it in, I've hit enter, I'm getting a name error. Obviously, it's because the name of the function is incorrect. So the only way that you can fix this is to simply make the formula correct. which is by selecting average, and then it will resolve itself. So if you get a name error, always check that the formula or the function name is correct in the cell. Now, another time you might find this, if we go on to this second table, again, we're trying to work out the total of revenue this time, but I'm getting a name error. Now, if I click on the cell and take a look in the formula bar, you can see I'm doing a sum, but I'm doing a sum by a named range, and I've called this named range values. So maybe I know that in the past I've created a named range called values, and I thought, right, I'm going to use that to sum up these numbers. Now I'm getting a name error because this named range doesn't actually exist. Now we can check that in a couple of ways. If we go to the Formulas tab, into the Name Manager, notice here I've got a few things in here, but these are some of the tables that we have on some of the other worksheets. I don't actually have a named range called values, so it's not visible in there. Another way we could check our named ranges is to click the drop down just here, and this will show us any named ranges and tables we have set up. So again, I don't have anything called values in here. So I've used an invalid named range. So the easiest way to fix this is to either remove this and just do a regular sum on this range of cells, or alternatively, you could just quickly create the name. I'm going to select my cells first of all, and we're going to give this cell range a name. In the name box, we're going to type in values, hit enter. As soon as I do that, you can see that the error has been resolved because this is now a valid named range called values. Okay, so if you see a name error, check your formula and also check that you're not using an invalid named range. Now, ref errors can occur in numerous different circumstances, and you generally tend to get these when you're doing things like cleaning data, and I'm going to show you a quick example of that in a moment. And a ref error normally appears when you are referring to a column or a cell that's been deleted. That's when you'll see a reference error. So let's take a look at this first example in this little table just here. We've got some customers. Again, you may recognize some of these. We've got a revenue column and we have a costs column. And I just want to calculate what the profit is. So this is a very simple calculation. We're just going to do revenue minus costs. Control Enter to stay in the same cell, and then we can double click to copy that formula down. Now the formula is absolutely fine, but if I go in and maybe I decide that I don't want the revenue column anymore and I delete that out, that's when you're going to get a reference error. Because if we take a look at the formula, we're now trying to refer to a column, to data, that's now no longer there. That's when you'll get a reference error. So if we go back, a way that we can fix this is to either not delete the column. If you do have to delete the column, then you can stop this from happening by copying and pasting the values in the cells to remove the formula underneath. So for example, what I could do, if I wanted to delete the revenue column, I could select these cells, I can press Control C, and then if you're using Excel 365, you can use a keyboard shortcut, Control Shift V, to paste the values only. If you're using a different version of Excel, you go to the Home tab, click the lower half of the Paste button, and choose Paste Values. Now what that will do is it will essentially throw away the underlying formula underneath and just keep the value. So it means that you can safely go in and delete out this column, and it's not going to have any effect on that profit column. So that's what a ref error is. Now, as I mentioned, I come across these frequently when I'm doing things like cleaning data. So in example 2, we have the same data or similar data, but we have a column that we need to clean up. So you can see here with the customers, these are particularly consistent in their format. So we have some customers who are in uppercase, we have some that are in lowercase, and we also have these weird spacing issues going on. So what I would do is I would make sure that this column was clean and tidy before I went any further into my analysis. Now, there are various different ways that you can clean data. I'm sure you can think of quite a few. The most popular way at the moment is to use something like Power Query to clean up your data, but a lot of people will still tidy their data using Excel functions. So let me show you how I would do this and when you can get a ref error. So I'm going to insert a new column, Control Shift plus. Now, what I can do here is if I want to tidy these up, the first thing I'm going to deal with is the actual case of the customer. So I want these to be in what we call proper case, where the first letter is capitalized only. So I'm going to type in equals proper. Now, I also want to make sure that I trim off any of these weird spaces at the beginning. So I'm going to combine it with the trim function. I'm going to select the customer. We can then close off trim and close off proper and hit enter. And that's essentially going to clean all of this column so that these look a lot more consistent. Now, what generally tends to happen is people do this and they think, okay, brilliant, I've got my clean column. I can now go in and delete this column out. And that's when they get the ref error. Because again, the same as in the first example, we're trying to refer, or we've deleted a column which this formula refers to. So in order to do this, again, we would need to do our little copy and paste values trick. So I'm going to select these, Control C, and I'm going to use Control Shift V to paste just the values over the top. I can then move the heading across and I can delete out this column safely without getting a reference error. All right. So ref errors, you've deleted something, that's why you're getting them. Let's take a look at the next example. So div error. This is a divide by zero error. So you might get this if you're trying to do some kind of division where it's recognized that you're trying to divide by zero, because in Excel, dividing by zero is a bit of a no-no. If we take a look at our table of data in our example one, we've got a list of customers just here. We've got this year's sales and the previous year's sales. And maybe I'm trying to work out the percentage change from the previous year. And I've already got my calculation in the first cell. Again, a very simple calculation. But notice that for some of these customers, we don't actually have the previous year's value input in. So if I try and drag this down, I'm going to get div errors because effectively the formula is doing a division, but it can't divide by zero. And Excel sees these empty cells as a zero. Even if I was to put a zero in there, it's still going to say div error, okay, because we can't divide by zero. Now, the thing not to do in this situation would be to delete out these div errors, because it means as soon as you enter the previous year's value into here, then your formula isn't going to work. So you kind of want to leave them in here, because when I do get these values, I can just type them in, and then the formula or the error will resolve itself because we now have something in this cell. Now, if you do have data that looks like this and you don't want these errors scattered throughout because they do look kind of messy, then this is where you would use error handling again. So if we go to the first cell, I would use if error here to handle these errors. So we're going to type in if error. Our value is being generated by our formula, and then on the end here, I would just have a blank. So we want 2 quote marks, close the bracket, hit enter, and now when we copy this down, instead of those div errors, we're just going to get blank cells. So that looks a lot tidier, and then when it does come time to put our values in again, then everything is working correctly. Okay, so don't delete them out because then you're going to have problems with your formula. And if we take a look at another example of when you might get a div error, again, here I just have a list of values and I'm getting a div error. Let's take a look at what formula we have in here. We're doing an average ifs just here. So what's this formula actually doing? Well, we're trying to work out the average, but we have criteria. So what we're saying here is the average range is this cell range, H7 to H10. Our criteria range is the same cell range, but we only want to find the average for values greater than 50. Now, if you take a look at my numbers, you can see that I don't actually have any values that are greater than 50. That is why we're getting the error. And it's a div error because we're doing an average. And to calculate an average, we basically divide the number of items by the total. Okay, so again, if you're getting a div error in a situation like this, check to make sure that the criteria that you're actually using is valid. Now, I could fix this by simply changing this to a number that is valid. So maybe I want to find out the average, but only for the values that are over 10. I can hit enter, and then you can see that it works itself out. All right, so div errors, you're trying to divide by 0. Let's move across to the final example of errors. And this is one that will come up at various different points. And you'll see in this first example, again, we just have some manager names. We have some sales that they've generated, and I need to work out the total. Now, notice that for some of these managers, I have NA in there. Okay, so maybe I haven't collected the sales results for Jane and Oliver as yet. So we've just got NA in the cell. But if I want to add these up, check out what happens. If I try and use the shortcut to do a sum, Alt equals, it stops at the first NA error. So I can't really use that. Let's escape out. What about if I force it to do a sum by actually selecting the cell range? Is it going to work? No, it's going to give me NA. So if you have NA in cells, you can't add them up because the result is always going to be NA. What about if we do want to add these up, but we also want to keep NA in the cells? We can do that, but we need to use a different formula. There's a formula in Excel called aggregate, which will allow you to add up a range of numbers and ignore any errors that are in cells. So this sounds like what we need. Let's type in equals aggregate. Now, the aggregate function, we can perform all different kinds of calculations. We can choose them from a big long list. Now, we're doing a sum, so I'm going to go down to number 9. Let's press tab, comma. This is where we can choose what we want to ignore. So there are many things we can ignore here. We can ignore things like hidden rows. We can ignore errors. We can ignore both if we wanted to. Now, I have errors, so I want to say ignore error values, comma. Then the array. So we just need to select the cell range. So this time, if we hit enter, we're getting the total. It's performing the sum calculation despite the fact that we have NA scattered throughout our data. So that's really useful to know if you need to keep anything like this in your data. NA errors, again, will occur when you're doing things like lookups. And I'm sure you've encountered this before if you've done anything like a VLOOKUP or an index and match, something like that. So in this example, you can see we've got a table of data. Again, we've just got some managers. We've got the region that they are managing. We have the revenue and we have the profit for that particular manager. Now, what I want to do is over here, I want to be able to type in the name of the manager and have it return the revenue. So this, we could use a simple VLOOKUP, we could use XLOOKUP, we could use index and match, whichever one you prefer. Now, I'm going to use VLOOKUP simply because that seems to be the one that most people are familiar with. Lookup value. So what are we looking up in this table? Well, we're looking up the manager, which is Sarah, comma. Table array. Where are we looking up Sarah? Well, we're looking her up in this table over here. So I'm going to select the table, which I've called data, comma. Column index number, what do we want to return from the table? Well, I want to return the revenue for Sarah. And as we know, if you're used to using VLOOKUP, we number our columns from left to right. So the manager column is number 1, the region column is number 2, and the revenue column is number 3. So we want to return column number 3. Are we doing an approximate or an exact match? Well, I want to exactly match the name Sarah in the table. So we want a false on the end here, or we want a 0. Now, when I hit enter, it's going to return the result because Sarah is the top one in the table and her revenue is 504. What about if I say Olivia? Hit enter. Well, yes, we have an Olivia in the table and it's returning the correct revenue. What about if I type in Max? That's when I'm getting my NA error. So if you've ever seen this when you're working with VLOOKUP, it just means that your lookup value, in this case Max, doesn't exist in the table. So if I take a look down, I can see that no, I don't have Max in there. Now, a couple of different ways that you could deal with this. If you just want to mask the NA error, again, you could just add error handling into the formula. Now, in the previous two examples, we used if error. And if error will allow you to handle any type of error in Excel. But we also have an error handling formula called if NA, but it only handles NA errors. Now, that's what we have in this case. So I can jump back up to the formula bar, and I'm going to use if NA. My value is being generated by my VLOOKUP. So I just need to go to the end here and I just specify what I want it to say in the cell if it can't find the lookup value. So I'm just going to say not found. Close the bracket, hit enter, and there we go. Now I'm going to change this to text formatting instead of accounting. There we go. All right, so that just makes your formula a little bit easier, a little bit more meaningful to anybody looking at your spreadsheet. They don't wonder why there's an NA error just there. Now, this moves me on very nicely to talking about ways that or things that you can implement to cut down on the amount of errors that are going into your spreadsheets. Because particularly in this age where we're sharing spreadsheets with lots of different people, remember, people that you share spreadsheets with will have varying levels of skill in Excel. Some people might be brilliant at formulas and understand everything that you've done, whereas other people might have less knowledge, and it's very easy for them to do things like break formulas that you've worked so hard on. So the more that we can do to protect our workbooks against unnecessary changes or errors, things like that, then the better. So in this particular scenario, what I would do is I would make sure that these managers are in a data validation dropdown so that people can't just come into the cell and start typing random names, because they could make a spelling mistake and think that that person doesn't exist in the table when they actually do. For example, let's say instead of Noah, I type in Noah, something like that. So I might think that Noah isn't found when he actually is. I've just spelt his name wrong. So to prevent that, I would put this in a data validation dropdown. So let's just run through that. You might be familiar with this already, but on the data tab, if we go across to data tools, we want to select data validation. We're going to say we want to create a list, and the source of our list is going to be all of our manager names. So I'm just going to select all of these. Remember, you can do a keyboard shortcut of Control-Shift down arrow to select all of the data in a column. Click on OK, and it means that people are now restricted to typing or to selecting here what they see in the list. So it means that they're not just going to come in and start trying to type random things in here. Now, it is still possible for people to come to this cell, double click, and I could type in Max. But when they hit enter, they're going to get an error message pop up from Excel. The value doesn't match the data validation restrictions. Now, if you are being particularly good, you could create your own little error messages just to really protect your spreadsheets and make this message a little bit more meaningful for people who maybe aren't quite as good with Excel. Because when you're setting up this data validation list, if we go back into it, notice you have two other tabs at the top here, input message and error alert. So instead of that generic error that just popped up, we could customize our own. So I can choose if I want stop, warning, or information. Let's just say warning, and then we can add a title. I'm going to say wait, please choose a manager from the drop-down list, something like that, just to give them a little bit of direction. So that if somebody does come over here and then try to type in something, they're going to get a message that's a little bit more meaningful. Okay. And as for the input messages that you can also add, if we go back to here, aside from error alerts, we can choose input messages. And this is a message that will appear when they hover their mouse over the cell. So again, you could put something like, wait, please choose from the list. I'll just make it nice and short. Click on OK. And you can see when they go near that cell, it's going to pop up so that they know exactly what they should be doing. All right. So those are a couple of little things that you could possibly implement just to really safeguard your worksheets. Now, another thing that you could do is you could employ worksheet protection. And this is great if you have a spreadsheet that has lots of formulas in it that maybe you don't want people modifying, touching, accidentally changing, but you do want them to be able to edit other parts of the workbook, then protecting cells is a great way to go about this. So let's go back to the value spreadsheet. And let's say that this column here, where we have the profit, we have a little formula in here. So maybe I don't want anybody changing anything to do with this formula in the profit column. But I still want them to be able to edit the rest of the cells in here or the rest of the cells in the worksheet. I just want this column to be locked so that they can't mess with the formula. This is where we can choose the cells that we want to protect. Whenever I train this, people always think it's a little bit backwards, which I would agree with. Because when you're talking about protecting worksheets, one thing you need to remember is that by default, every single cell in Excel is locked. Now, people don't understand that because we can click in any cell, right? And we can start typing. So how is every cell locked? Well, every cell is locked, and we can check that by right-clicking, going to Format Cells, Protection. Notice the locked checkbox is selected, and you'll find that this is selected for any cell that you click on. So effectively, all cells are locked. The reason why we can still type into them is because the locking doesn't take effect until we protect the worksheet. So if I was to then go to the Review tab and choose Protect Sheet, like so, and I'm not going to add a password, let's just say OK. Now the cells are locked. When I try and type in one, I'm going to get this error. All right. Now notice, even when I've got it protected, you can still see me selecting cells. That's related to these options that you have when you click on Protect Sheet. Can you see the top two are selected? So I'm still allowing people to select locked cells and select unlocked cells. If I deselected both of these, when I protect the worksheet, they can't even click. All right, so that's the difference between those two. Now, just to go back to this point of locking these cells only, I want these ones to remain locked and I want these ones to be unlocked. So let's right click on here, Format Cells, Protection. These ones need to be unlocked. Click on OK. And I want these ones to be locked. So I'm going to select these, right click, Format Cells, and these need to be locked, which is correct. So then we can protect the sheets, click on OK, and we should find that we can now edit these cells just here, but we can't edit these ones. So if I try and edit the profit column, I'm going to get an error message, whereas I could come over here and start typing in these cells. All right. So again, that is a great way to protect certain parts of your worksheet to cut down on the amount of errors that are going into your workbooks. So just a couple of little things that you can do to keep your spreadsheets as error-free as possible. Now, when it comes to formula auditing, if we go to the formulas ribbon, you'll notice that we have an entire formula auditing group just here, and we have various different things we could do. Now, sometimes these can be really helpful, sometimes not so much. You know, the amount I use these, I would say, is pretty minimal when it comes to sort of tracing errors. These become more important when you have reasonably complicated spreadsheets where you might have one cell with a formula in it that refers to different worksheets, different workbooks, different cells, a more complex formula. That's when these can become useful if you're really trying to sort of track back through your formula to find where the issue is. So for example, if I click on this cell just here where we have our VLOOKUP formula, if I wanted to find out which cells are precedents or which cells rely on this formula or which cells the formula relies on, I can click that and it's going to put some arrows on the screen. So basically here it's saying in this formula, I use the value in cell G6, which is Emma currently, and I also use the data in this table. So both this range just here and this cell are used in this formula. So if you want to be able to see the cells that the formula is referring to in a more meaningful way, then you can use trace precedence or trace dependence. Once you have these arrows on the screen, if you want to get rid of them, we have a remove arrows option just here. Now, when we do have an error, you'll see that you get this little warning triangle just here. So when we click it, we get some options which can also help us determine what's causing this error. So it's telling me there is an error in the value. So my first step here would be to look at that formula. I can go to help if I want to search the help files for more information on this error, or I can choose to show the calculation steps. I can even choose to ignore the error. So sometimes in a spreadsheet, it will sort of flag up a little green triangle on the corner, but it's not actually an error. So you can choose to ignore errors if you need to. Similarly, we have very similar options on the formulas ribbon. As I said, over here, we have error checking. So for this one, for example, it's looking in cell B9, it's looking at the formula, and it's telling me underneath a value used in the formula is of the wrong data type. So this pretty much spells it out for me. I could then delve into this a bit further. I could say show calculation steps, where it's literally going to step me through the formula. So I could say, okay, let's evaluate. It's evaluating to a value error. Okay. Now, sometimes this can be useful. Again, if you've got a longer formula, it will work through each cell reference and it will show you value where the error is actually occurring. So you can pinpoint it down to a very specific cell reference and then investigate that a little bit further. Okay. So don't forget you have these formula auditing tools up here.
A big congratulations, everyone, for making it all the way to the end of this course. So it's just about time for me to sign off and say goodbye to you all. I hope you enjoyed running through this course as much as I've enjoyed teaching it to you. Once again, my name is Deb. Bye for now.
If you're not a subscriber, click down below to subscribe so you get notified about similar videos we upload. To see the full course that this video came from, click over there. And click over there to see more videos from Simon Says It.